Tatsalach, Manamawash, Inim Lautiwa, Inwanikwash, Wailat Putimpt, Ka'an Kinikmaman. And good afternoon, everybody. My name is Matt Johnson. In the Cayuse dialect of the Nez Perce language, my name is Appaloosa from the Dawn. And I'm really happy to be here with you today. Thank you all for being here. As Roger stated, I'm going to talk a little bit about our treaty and some of the context surrounding the treaty negotiations, the terms that are in the treaty, and I will also, time permitting, go from there to the development of our tribal constitution and the growth of our modern or contemporary government. So I'd like to start by talking about, I guess you would say, the temporal context, the depth of time that Indian people have been in this area. And this picture is of Rattlesnake Mountain. It's in the Tri-Cities area in Washington. In the Sahaptin language, it's known as Lalik. And I took this picture looking west towards Rattlesnake Mountain. This is a really interesting place because during the time of the glacial Missoula floods, there's stories that have been passed down of Indian people taking refuge on Lalik to escape the flooding. So just thinking about, when I think about, the hundreds of generations that have passed since then, the thousands and thousands of years, the floods were at least, 12,000, 10, 12,000, 15,000 years ago. And just the fact that knowledge of people escaping the flooding, Indian people escaping the flooding, still exists today, is pretty amazing to me. So that's just something I always like to point out to begin with. That a lot of our people say, we've always been here since time immemorial. I think the record easily shows we've been here at least 10, 12, 15,000 years, at the bare minimum. Spatially, this map shows the range that our people traveled historically or traditionally to access resources, to trade, to maintain kinship relationships, and also to raid or conduct war parties at times. So you can see we went well into Montana, Wyoming. I believe there's information as well. This map I think could show that we went as far as Salt Lake, and then I was just talking with Jennifer Carson Ingham, who stated that there was actually more evidence for increased use down the Columbia River and into the Willamette Falls area. So there's some shading that shows areas of heavier use in our homelands. Obviously here where we are today and in the nearer areas, but I think that this map could be updated as well to show some additional heavier usage in certain areas that we traditionally access for resources and other purposes. And then, taking into account the temporal, the spatial context, the amount of time we've been here, the areas we've traveled to, these are some of the things in recent time that have affected our use of our traditional areas. In a positive way, acquisition of the horse, enabled our people to travel longer distances. So that was a very beneficial development. Cayuse people especially were known for having huge herds of horses. Lewis and Clark came through, and I'm not going to go through these all in detail, but just giving you a sense of some of the sort of recent events that have affected our people. Disrupted some traditional ways, and also had some positive impacts as well. I think something that can't be overstated is the impact of disease. I know there was epidemics coming through as early as the 1770s, but the 1824, 1825 smallpox epidemic was a really severe one. But then again, we had people who were able to survive, and there were other populations along the coast. I know, or I've read about some sources indicating that as many as 90% of Central California, Willamette Valley, tribes along the coast were affected in the early 1830s by a malaria epidemic, and as many as 90% of their populations were killed by that malaria epidemic. So in some senses we were lucky to be more inland, somewhat removed from some easier sources or ways of travel, but that doesn't mean we were not affected by disease. We were heavily affected by disease even by the time Lewis and Clark had arrived. So. But then, one of the really strong precursors for the treaty negotiations in 1855 was the Whitman killings, the incident that occurred there. The United States wanted some certainty and safety for travelers, immigrants to be able to come over on the Oregon Trail. So Isaac I. Stevens went through the Northwest, started in the Puget Sound area, conducting treaty negotiations with a number of tribes through the Puget Sound, then made his way in 1855 to the Walla Walla Treaty Council. At Walla Walla, there were representatives for not just the Cayuse, Umatilla, and Walla Walla, also the Nez Perce and the Yakima tribes, you might be aware. Their treaty negotiations took place at the same time. I think something that many people might not know, or maybe many people in this room do know, but the Umatilla Reservation was actually not part of the original plan for the United States in the treaty negotiations at Walla Walla. The Cayuse, Umatilla, and Walla Walla people were, the United States intent was for them to all move on to either the Yakima Reservation or the Nez Perce Reservation. That was not acceptable to the Cayuse as well as Umatilla and Walla Walla people. And during those treaty negotiations, essentially the Cayuse took the position that they wouldn't agree to the treaty, that they would go to war and basically just fight to the death rather than accept moving out of their homelands onto one of the other reservations. So during the treaty negotiations, Isaac I. Stevens and Joel Palmer were forced to create the third treaty and the Umatilla Reservation and present that to the tribes at the Treaty Council. So I don't know where I got this in my head, but maybe it was from history book in elementary school or cartoons or I don't know what, but I always had this image in my head or this idea that Indian people weren't good negotiators, that they didn't know what they were bargaining for or negotiating for. And I guess the representative idea of that or symbol of that is Manhattan being sold for a string of beads or something like that. And again, I don't know where I got that in my head, but somehow I got it in my head at some point. But as I've learned more about our treaty, I've come to understand that, especially for our people, or I can only speak to our treaty, that really nothing could be further from the truth. That our people understood the stakes, they knew what they were negotiating for, they knew what they were giving up. It doesn't mean there wasn't duress or that it was an equal bargaining table, but definitely there was a pretty clear understanding of what was at stake. So I just want to emphasize that, as well as the sacrifice, the amount of land that was given up was really immense. So you think 6.4 million acres, hundreds of square miles. And retaining the reservation that we did, that was a small victory, but we were able to retain this reservation and have it as our future homelands, which I'm glad that we still do to this day. So this map you might have seen, but it shows the outline of the ceded boundaries as well as the reservation there in the interior part. And the lawyer in me can't help but state that this map, these ceded land boundaries were drawn for a specific purpose. They were for the Indian Claims Commission fishing rights claims in the 1950s. So there's still, not perfect clarity on the ceded land boundaries. I know that we'll get into the some of the terms in the treaty, and it's not perfectly clear what could be meant, or there was different ways to interpret some of the landmarks that were identified in the treaty. So these boundaries are the best example that we have, which was created for one specific purpose, but I would say there's not probably unanimous agreement among the various neighboring tribes about the extent of these boundaries, but this is what we go on. So the yellow, kind of lighter yellow and darker yellow is the ceded lands, and you can see they go from up above the Tri-Cities, the White Bluffs, on the Columbia River, the Big Bend of the Columbia there, down to John Day almost in the southwest, over to just about Ontario, and then up in the northeast, just around Dayton or Waitsburg, Washington. So this was what was, again, an interpretation of the ceded land boundaries for a specific purpose, but this is what we have. And then the interior, the dark blue, is the current reservation today. The lighter blue the darker blue is what we call the diminished reservation. The lighter blue includes the surveyed reservation, and then the green area is what we refer to as the east boundary. In the treaty of 1855, the boundaries of the ceded lands and the reservation were described in metes and bounds, which I might as well go on to that. Let's see. I'm sorry. No, I'll stay here. The treaty boundaries were described in metes and bounds, and then the reservation was surveyed several years later. And during the course of that survey, everything in that green area was basically lopped off the reservation. So that's an issue we're still working on. Something that I think is still an active issue for us. I would just put it that way. I also think it's really important to emphasize for anyone who's not familiar with Indian treaty rights, Indian law, the rights the tribes and the Indian people reserved in the treaties were not given to the Indian people. They were inherent rights that we'd always exercise in this area when we were the only sovereign entities around. And so what we retained in the treaty was pretty much a bare minimum of what we could hold on to, but it was rights that we'd always had, rights that we'd always exercised, rights to hunt, fish, gather at our usual and custom places, and basically to govern our own affairs as we saw fit. So there was a system in place for thousands and thousands of years that it was not a panacea, it was not perfect, it wasn't the Garden of Eden, but we had a system that was working, that we'd abided by for thousands and thousands of years, and through the treaty, we were able to hold on, to be able to continue to exercise those ways within our homelands that we have today. Also, in the United States Constitution, Indian treaties are specifically called out as, treaties in general with foreign nations, which at the time included Indian tribes, are called out as the supreme law of the land. So Indian treaties are, or should be interpreted or seen as superior to federal law, superior to state law. This is something that's entered into by the United States under the Constitution. Obviously, that's not always been the practice. Treaty provisions have not always been faithfully or completely fulfilled or implemented, and we'll get into potentially some examples of that. But under the Constitution, treaties are the supreme law of the land. This is just another look at the reservation as it exists today. To return to the specific provisions of the treaty, Article 1 outlines the ceded lands as well as the reservation boundaries. Again, this was done in metes and bounds, so it was done basically, I want to say on the fly, maybe that's oversimplifying it, but at the time of the treaty negotiations by Palmer and Stevens. Of course, they'd been here for not that long. They were doing the best they could to describe boundaries that made sense for outlining what the tribes were willing or able to cede, as well as what they were retaining. But again, you see some of these terms are not totally clear, or there might have been some interpretation. And I should say too, this is not a comprehensive list or exclusive list. There's more identifiers, metes and bounds described in the treaty, but I just pulled some out for reference so you get a sense of kind of how the treaty describes the ceded lands as well as the boundaries of the reservation. Those three at the bottom, Wild Horse Creek, Birch Creek, and Lee's Encampment, are the reference to the reservation boundaries. And also in Article 1, in addition to the lands ceded and retained, it talks about our fishing, hunting, gathering, and pasturing rights. And if you read the Treaty Council minutes, it's very clear that these rights were critical and were some of the main things that the people who were present there representing the Indians were most concerned about, making sure they could continue to carry out, to access and to maintain the relationship that we had with the land, and really the duty that we had to take care of the resources that we still have today. On the reservation, the fishing right is an exclusive one. That means free from really state or regulation. Off the reservation, we have a fishing right in common with all citizens of the United States at our usual and accustomed fishing places. That is a right that's been heavily litigated, and it's been determined to be much more than just the right to go fishing. It's the right, again, to be free from state regulation, especially non-conservation based state regulations. It's the right includes the right to cross private property to access usual and accustomed fishing places. It's also a right to a fair share of the harvestable portion of the fish. So that's been determined to be up to 50% of the harvestable runs of fish at any of our usual and custom fishing places. So the treaty fishing right, again, has been heavily litigated for a long time in Washington and Oregon, and we're still engaged in I believe U.S. v. Oregon is the longest running federal court case in existence. It's been going on for over 40 years now, I believe, and we continue to manage the fish runs in Oregon in conjunction with the state of Oregon through that litigation. Hunting, gathering, and pasturing rights are worded a little different. They're stated that they can be exercised on unclaimed lands. Unclaimed lands are typically thought of, again, through judicial decisions and litigation, have been outlined to basically mean public lands that are consistent with the purposes that we'd use them for. So, nobody would want to go hunting in a little tiny park within, a city. You want to go hunting where there's elk and deer and where it's a reasonable place to hunt. So, but those rights do exist, again, on public lands, federal lands, lands where we can find the resources and that are consistent with those types of uses that we'd like to exercise. Articles 2 to 4 have a bit of overlap in them. I think there's some things in here that I'm not totally sure to what extent they were actually fulfilled, particularly the annuities provision. There's a statement in Article 2 that says that tribal members that moved onto the reservation, or Indian people that would move onto the reservation would be paid $8,000 for the first 5 years, then descending to $6,000 for the next 5 years, $5,000 for 5 years, or something to that effect, then $2,000, I think, for the last 5 years. Of course, after the treaty was signed in 1855, it wasn't ratified by the President and Congress until 1859. So the payments were intended to start in 1856. The treaty wasn't even fully in effect at that point. So I'm sure that the payment if there were any payments, they didn't start in 1856. I'm thinking they likely did not occur at all, because through that entire period where the annuities were identified, that's basically the time of the Northwest Indian Wars. So there was a lot of, again, uncertainty about what was happening, what was going on. Even though the treaty was intended to create certainty and safety, the initial reaction was not that, for a number of reasons, one of which is even though the treaty was signed in 1855, and word got out pretty quick that the treaty had been signed, it was not well understood that it had not been ratified yet, and so people did start to move on to the reservation lands, non-Indians started to move on to the reservation lands fairly soon, which was a source of conflict that contributed to some of the skirmishes and battles that took place. You can see some of there in the improvements, some of the things that Indian tribes and Indian people today, I think do kind of point to as the seeds of some of the federal obligations to Indian people and tribes that still exist. Especially healthcare is a big one. And there was language in our treaty, stating that the United States would fund a hospital, that they'd provide a physician for a period of years, medicines, other hospital supplies. You can also see, some of the early efforts at assimilation, at agricultural necessities, things that could be used for farming, were some of the things that were identified in our treaty and to be provided to our people. You can see just some of those things there. Article 5 talks about housing for the 3 head chiefs, one each for Umatilla, Cayuse, and Walla Walla, Pio Pio Mox Mox for the Walla Walla's young chief, and Wanapsnoot were the other 2 head chiefs, or that were identified in the treaty. Interestingly as well, or at least I think it's interesting, Pio Pio Mox Mox was called out specifically for having the right to build a house and trading post at the mouth of the Yakima River, again in the Tri-Cities area in Washington. But that provision was not fulfilled because Pio Pio Mox Mox was killed during, while in custody by a United States regiment or a voluntary military during one of the Indian Wars in late 1850s. So he was killed before that provision could be implemented. Also, there's language in Article 5 stating that the wagon road, basically the Oregon Trail, would be rerouted to be south of the reservation, and that I believe is also a provision. My understanding that from conversation with some of our attorneys did not occur. I think it's pretty obvious that didn't occur. And then there's a number of, I would say, more minor provisions relative to the first couple. In Article 6, you kind of see the seeds of allotment. It talks about surveying the land, parceling the land, providing individual parcels to males and families in certain, should the president deem fit. The Article 7 is really just one line that states what is stated there, and Article 9 states that we would that Indian people should not drink, should not be allowed alcohol on the reservation. There's U.S. Code provision that states that tribes can develop their own liquor codes and work with the federal government to regulate the sale of alcohol on the reservation. So even though we have a temperance, basically a no alcohol provision in our treaty, we do have a liquor code, and today, you see alcohol sales here, like at Wild Horse and things like that. So, and again, Article 11 stated the ratification language, and that did not take place for 4 years, and after the signing of the treaty at Walla Walla. Also, you might note the date for people that are familiar with the date that Oregon became a state. Our treaty was ratified about a month after Oregon became a state. I don't know if this is true, but I get the sense somebody was like, oh crap, we forgot to do something, and I had to go. So there were 36 signers for the Cayuse, Umatilla, and Walla Walla. There were over, I believe, 3,000 people counted at the Treaty Council representing Umatilla, Walla Walla, Cayuse people. No, I'm sorry, I might have that a little high, 1,800 at least, but there was a lot more Indians there. Basically, 36 people signed for 1,800, 2,000 more people than that. There was not total disagreement. I think we heard a little bit about, or I've heard a little bit of the parts I've been able to be here for this conference about that, and I think Blaine Harden touched a little bit on that, that, you know, there was factions, there were disputes, not everybody agreed on the right way to go among the tribes. Some people did just want to, you know, they wanted to just fight to the death and go out really on their terms. Other people were willing to sacrifice, and to sacrifice in a different way, to sacrifice some of the homelands and to try and survive and maintain what we could. So this is kind of a abrupt transition, but you know, the Treaty of 1855 was signed, ratified in 1859. We didn't draft and approve our tribal constitution until 1949. So you've got a period in there of almost 100 years where we hadn't yet kind of reorganized ourselves or kind of recovered to a way to be able to engage with the United States in sort of a formal way. You see in some of these different policy concepts that the United States tried, really all of them were aimed at assimilating Indian people. I mean, you could pretty much go through every one and say it was either designed to eliminate Indian people, change them into white people, or it was designed just to make Indian people act more like white people and be able to behave in a way that the United States could understand, that they could engage with. That's really what I think, in my opinion, Indian reorganization was about, was enabling the United States to interact with tribes in a government-to-government way. Even self-determination and self-governance, which has been really, I think, a positive thing for a lot of tribes, including Umatilla, you know, to some extent, to carry out those federal duties and take the federal funding to carry out the programs that would otherwise be carried out by the United States. You have to step into the federal shoes, so to some extent you're still having to act like the federal government. One thing I want to focus on a little bit more in detail is allotment, which, you know, had a pretty severe effect on a reservation. Broke up the integrity of our reservation boundaries and just made jurisdiction and development much more complicated. Again, we did have language in our treaty that was kind of a precursor to allotment. We also had a specific allotment act, the Slater Act, that predated the Dawes Act, the General Allotment Act, by a few years. So we, again, I don't know that we were the first, but we were, you know, sort of a pilot project for allotment in some way. And you can see there the statistic or the terms of the parcels that were provided to people, and that resulted in a lot of the reservation being sold off, because after the parcels were provided to individual families and people, the excess lands were then made available for sale to non-Indians. So that really had a severe impact on our reservation, not just by selling off a good portion of our lands. It also, which created the sort of checkerboard effect, it also has through time created what's known as fractionation, where at one point, you know, you had a family that owned 160-acre parcel that, you know, gets devised through probate process or a will or estate to, you know, a number of heirs, and then now we have a situation today where we could have 100 people having full ownership of, you know, a 2-acre parcel of land. So it makes administrating and managing those lands really difficult, and the tribe is actively working to acquire lands and to reduce fractionation where we can. Also, you've got this checkerboarded, you kind of get the sense from this kind of diffuse color map, but checkerboarding has resulted in jurisdictional issues on the reservation. You know, you have land that's held in trust by the United States for the tribe. You have land that's owned in fee by non-Indians. You have land that's owned in fee by Indian people as well. And then you also have land that's allotted land that's held in trust by the United States for individual Indians. So you got 4 different kind of categories of land ownership just within the reservation. I think fortunately, we've had a pretty good relationship, or have worked on a relationship with Umatilla County, and that's helped with some of the potential zoning issues and things that could arise in that kind of area. But definitely there's still jurisdictional issues, and it can get really complicated really fast to figure out what jurisdiction applies. But then, going through that allotment period, we were able to, or again, very fortunate in my opinion, to have a group of leaders who got together, formed a business council, hired an attorney, and drafted a constitution. And in 1949, that constitution got approved. If I'm not mistaken, maybe Bobby or somebody can correct me, I believe the vote was 113 to 104 to approve the tribal constitution. So it was, again, a close vote, not a unanimous decision by any means. But that vote and that did create our current contemporary government, which is governed by what we call the Board of Trustees. It's a 9-member board. They're elected every 2 years, and they're voted on by the General Council, which is the membership of the tribe age 18 and older. So currently today we have a little over 3,100 tribal members. A lot of them live on or near the reservation. About half at least live on or near the reservation. We have a lot of people living in Portland, Tri-Cities, Walla Walla. I believe though we have at least one tribal member living in almost every state in the United States. Again, General Council elects the board. The board makes policy. Really, I think an interesting thing about our Constitution as well is that it's really become a 2-branch government. In the original Constitution, really, it was just the Board of Trustees had pretty much all of the decision-making authority. They had the authority to make laws. They had the authority to manage the day-to-day affairs of the tribe. They have the authority to negotiate with other governmental entities. So really, the Board of Trustees has a lot of the authority for the management and direction of the tribe. In 2011, I think I'm getting a little ahead of myself here. Oh yeah, let me do this. This is our current board, just showing our representatives on our current board. Chairman Gary Burke, Vice Chair Aaron Ashley, Treasurer Mooney Husties, Secretary Roberta Wilson, and Alan Crawford. Gum Crawford is the General Council Chair. Our General Council, the members, the 18-year and older members of the tribe, we have monthly General Council meetings. So the General Council Chair oversees those meetings. He's also an ex officio member of the Board of Trustees, so he can vote. He votes as a member of the board as well. And then Corey and Sam, Stephen Hart, Lisa Gunwellis, and Toby Patrick are members at large. In 2011, the tribe passed a constitutional referendum to recognize the tribal court as the sole body to adjudicate disputes and enunciate principles of law for the tribe. So, when I kind of started to say, we have a different sort of governmental setup with the Board of Trustees having so much authority. Really, we're a 2-branch government with the Board of Trustees and the tribal court. The board does delegate a lot of authority, a lot of duties and decision-making authority to the Office of Executive Director. As a staff person of the tribal court, and also as the son of the chief judge, Bill Johnson, who's sitting over here in the corner, I'm really proud of the tribal court's development over the last 40 years, and I think it showed a lot of trust in the court to be able to exercise its duties fairly. That the tribe, that the General Council passed that constitutional referendum to acknowledge the court as a separate, essentially a separate branch of government. I think I'm getting short on time, so won't get into detail on the jurisdictional issues. We do exercise criminal jurisdiction over all Indians on the reservation. We also have, through the Violence Against Women Act, some limited jurisdiction over non-Indians who commit domestic violence related crimes generally against Indian people on the reservation. And we have been carrying that out for the last decade or so. So again, I think we're just kind of starting to wrap up here. We passed our own constitution in 1949. We passed a constitutional amendment in 2011 to recognize the court as a separate branch of government. I mean, these are extremely recent things. So we're very young government in terms of a constitutional Western style government, we're growing pretty quickly right now. So again, I think we've been extremely fortunate to have really visionary, strong leaders that were not just looking out for their own interests, but were thinking a long ways down the road and helping us to be able to still be here today and to be in the position that we are. So again, there's been all kinds of federal policies that have either been designed to try and eliminate Indian people or change them into into white people, and those have had more or less success in certain ways, but we are still here and still trying to carry out our own affairs and do things the way we see fit for the best interests of our people, and to continue to carry out that duty we have to take care of the land and the resources. So again, I'm just really glad to be able to talk with you all today, and you've probably seen some of these resources already, but if anybody would like additional information, there's a lot of information on our website. We have a number of social media channels and platforms. Our Place Names Atlas is an unbelievable resource if anybody is interested in place names and sort of the information in a geographical sense. Just an unbelievable reference guide, as well as our history book as well. So, and there's a number of dictionaries out there. So, and I hope everybody had a chance to visit Tmuslicht or has visited it before, but I think that's a really impressive resource as well. So please get by there if you haven't yet.